Kyle Klingman with Track Wrestling, going to Long Island, New York for one of my favorites, part of my upbringing in the sport. It's Ken Bigley. He's been to numerous places from Sugar Camp, Wisconsin, went to the University of Northern Iowa, was there for 5 years, and then has been to a few schools along the way, Ohio, Princeton, Brown, was with Beat the Streets. Now he is the director of sports at the PSAL in New York City. Really appreciate this time, Ken.
Oh, no, thank you. My pleasure. Happy to be here.
And I said New York City. You're actually the PSAL director of New York. So explain what that position is.
I'm just a sports coordinator. I don't want to upset my boss if she ever watches it. She's the director. But no, I'm a sports coordinator. So the Public Schools Athletic League, it oversees all the high schools in New York City. You know, if New York City were its own state, I think we'd have the 6th largest state tournament in the country. So it's a big district. It's the largest school district in the United States. And so we're the governing body for sports in New York City, where NISFA is the governing body for sports in New York State. So in that role, I oversee wrestling, soccer, golf, the Mayor's Cup events, work on special projects, some compliance stuff, things like that. So it's fun. Get to see a lot of the 5 boroughs and meet a lot of great kids.
You graduated with a class of 20 kids, and so that probably doesn't leave a lot of workout partners. How did you develop in Sugar Camp, Wisconsin, and find wrestling initially?
Well, my father was an official. He was a wrestling official. He was a wrestler in high school. He went to Thomas Jefferson in Council Bluffs. My mom's from the Logan Magnolia, so wrestling's always been in our blood. And I got to tag along with my dad as he was an official in northern Wisconsin and watch wrestling. And then we had a youth club in Sugar Camp. The Sugar Camp Wrestling Club is where I got my start. And I was just very fortunate that my parents were really supportive of wrestling. My boss at the time, Scott Holowinski, was working in a cabinet shop. He was very supportive. So if I ever needed time off to go to wrestling camps, to go to tournaments, they were very supportive, and I was able to really develop and pursue my love of wrestling.
Did you take to it right away?
Yeah, I don't have vivid recollections from that age, but according to my parents, I really enjoyed it in kindergarten and 1st grade, and then took some time off in elementary school because I wasn't enjoying it, and then decided again maybe 5th or 6th grade to jump back in. And I think in middle school is really where I started developing a love and passion for wrestling. That's where it was really started to become part of my identity.
How'd you get to the University of Northern Iowa all the way from, it's up in northern Wisconsin, all the way down to northern Iowa?
Well, it was after my senior year when I had placed out at the Senior Nationals, got a call from Coach Greenlee and really wanted to check it out. My dad had gone to Northern Iowa. He told me for a semester. He was excited to see the campus again. So we took a drive down there. And by that point, I had visited a couple of different schools, and just Northern Iowa felt super comfortable. Really enjoyed getting to know Coach Briggs and Coach Greenlee. The campus felt perfect. It was the right size, wasn't too big, wasn't too small. Division I program, a lot of history and great coaches. And it just, I walked on campus and felt like that was the right place. And I think it was a good decision. I really enjoyed Northern Iowa. I think super highly of the athletic department, and some of the professors I had profoundly changed my life for the better. So I'm always appreciative of that opportunity to wrestle for the Panthers and graduate from UNI.
How'd you develop your style? I don't remember anyone that moved forward more, that had more bumps and bruises on their eyes, walk around campus. You're always bloodied and battered. How did you develop such an entertaining style?
I don't know. I think just aggressive by nature. I really, defensive wrestling bored me to no end. I didn't like to watch it. I didn't like to wrestle that way. And, for me, I wasn't the most technical wrestler, and I really depended on my conditioning. And if I wasn't moving forward earlier and making the opponent work, they weren't going to be tired by the 3rd period when I needed them to be tired. So I think a lot of it, strategically, it was just, I have to get this person tired or I'm not going to be able to win this match. I have to, a lot of my points came in the 3rd period when they were really out of breath. So in order to make that happen, you had to be really aggressive early on.
So it's kind of that nature nurture. You had something internally that you just drove toward. Is that what it was?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's nature nurture for sure, but a lot of it was strategic too. I knew that if I was going to score, if I was going to win that match, I had to get them tired because I didn't have the technical skills or the speed to score a lot of points in the first period, second period. I had to wear them out. That was a big part of that strategy.
Did you ever get feedback from your opponents that they dreaded wrestling you?
My teammates, not my opponents so much, but a lot of my teammates didn't like having me as a workout partner. I did get that when, some of them, they tell you after you graduate, man, when I ended up getting paired with you in practice, I always cursed under my breath. They knew they were going to have to work a little more.
Well, I want to go back 20 years. Some people know the movie and the book Fight Club. This is the author of Fight Club. This is called Stranger Than Fiction. There's a quote you have in here when you wrestled at the Northern Plains region. I'm going to read it to you. This is from 20 years ago. See if this is still accurate today. This is from you. When I was in college, I cried a lot just because it was so hard and I was never very good. I asked myself a lot of times why I did it. One analogy I like to use is it's like a drug. You get addicted to it. Sometimes you know it's not good for you, especially emotionally, some of those tough practices and bad competitions, but you just keep coming back for it. If I didn't need it, I wouldn't be here. You don't make money off it. You don't get any glory off it. It's just searching for the high, I guess. Is that still accurate?
I don't know if it's accurate. You get caught off guard. As a wrestler, you really don't get interviewed too often. So coming off a really disappointing finish at the Northern region to sort of get cornered by a great writer, a writer I admire who I was excited to meet, maybe tripping over my words a little bit there. But I think for most wrestlers, I don't think you would find too many wrestlers that, oh yeah, wrestling, it's so much fun. I can't wait to go to practice because it's going to be great. But there's just something in it that you need, something that drives you to it. And, maybe an addiction is a better analogy than a drug, but for sure, there's parts of that I think are accurate and still resonate.
What is it about this sport then? I mean, clearly you didn't go to the University of Northern Iowa to study in wrestling, but here you are 20 years later, you're still involved in it. I think you were in philosophy and some other classes that you took, but what is it about wrestling that keeps you in it so long?
One thing, when we started girls wrestling in New York City and really grew that, one of the posters we made is wrestling is for any body, and a reference to big, small, short, tall. And I think one of the things, all sports are great. They give kids a passion. They give them something to work towards excellence. It helps teach them delayed gratification. It helps them learn to be a team member, learn to be responsible, all of those things. But the one thing with wrestling, you can be not quick and not very athletic like I was, but have a good set of lungs, and it gives you an opportunity to be successful in the sport. So you can be short and be successful in the sport. You can be tall and skinny and be successful in the sport. So I think it's a sport that literally is accessible to anybody, and it gives, what all sports do. It gives young people an identity. It gives them a family. It gives them something to work towards. It gives them a passion. So I think that's a big part of it, is just our sport is so accessible.
You were with Beat the Streets for a while, and now you're no longer doing that, but I know you still have some involvement there. What kind of rewards have you seen? What kind of things have you seen instilled in those kids that are going to last them a lifetime?
For sure, just some of the self-confidence that you see grow in kids, seeing some of them a lot of them going off to college that probably wouldn't be going to college otherwise. Seeing the Beat the Streets coaches and the PSAL coaches, just seeing the tremendous impact that they have on kids, the hope that they give kids, the discipline and the lessons that they give the kids. There's a lot of really underserved neighborhoods and kids that, but for wrestling, their life would have taken a tremendously different trajectory, and seeing the trajectory that wrestling puts them on, specifically with the positive influence of their coaches, it's really pretty awesome.
We just had Ryan LeBlanc on for a podcast, and he was just hired at the Citadel. He's from New York, and we talked about the sections and how big of a deal that is. Could you elaborate on that and what that means to be from a different section and how you represent not only your school, but the section in New York too?
Yeah, I honestly think it's pretty weird. There's a lot of things that New York State does that kind of baffle me. But essentially the sections, there's 12 sections. The 12 sections are members of, or 11 sections, I don't even know, but they're members of the New York State Public High School Athletic Association. They're geographical sections within the state of New York. The Public Schools Athletic League, since it's its own governing body, is not a member of any section. We're just the PSAL. So when we go to the state tournament, wrestlers, rather than wearing their school uniform, they're wearing a singlet from their section. And they're wearing that singlet up until the finals. And for the Public Schools Athletic League kids, the New York City kids, they're wearing their PSAL New York City singlet. And I get it. It's kind of fun. You bond with the other kids from New York City. You bond with the kids from your section. You cheer for the kids from your section. But at the same time, coming from the Midwest where you're representing your school and wearing your school singlet with pride at the state tournament, it's still, I'm used to it now, but it's just odd. Just weird. Different. I'm not going to say odd. It's different. It definitely, there's certain things about it that definitely make the state tournament more fun, but I still not feeling it.
What is it though? Because New York is interesting in that way too, and that probably people think about New York as New York City, but there's mountains and farmland. It's a unique state in that way. What's the landscape of the entire state when you add in the biggest city in the United States and then farmland and mountains along with it?
Yeah, New York's kind of polarized like a lot of the country. You have downstate, Westchester, Long Island, that sort of leans one way, and then you have upstate, which is much more typically rural. So yeah, there is a lot of infighting. Albany is an interesting place. There's always conflict between upstate and downstate, and people around here, when they say they're from New York, they mean they're from New York City, assuming that's New York. But it's obviously a very big state, a very diverse state. There's a lot of differences even between where I live on Long Island and some of the Queens and Brooklyn suburbs. It's different. It's unique. It's an interesting state.
So when a lot of these New York City high schools wrestle against each other, are they just staying in New York City? They're not going out into the rural competition during the season?
Well, we have a lot of teams now that they're realizing that if they want to get better and they want to compete for state titles, they need to leave the 5 boroughs to compete. So some of our top tier programs in New York City, they always make an effort and do the fundraising so that they can leave the 5 boroughs once, twice, 3 times a year to go to tournaments on Long Island, to go to tournaments upstate. And just the way New York City, or not New York City, New York State does the seeding for the Federation tournament, it's important to get out there and wrestle the tougher competition from the different sections and see the different wrestlers. New York City is getting a lot better at wrestling. It's getting better every year. But if you want that tougher competition on a consistent basis, you really need to get out of the 5 boroughs and see some of that tougher competition.
When you're from a rural area in Wisconsin, do you visualize yourself eventually being in the biggest city in the United States?
No, no, it's funny. Growing up, my sister had a poster of New York City on her bedroom wall, like the skyline. And, growing up, my parents always thought she was going to end up in the urban area, and I was going to stay in Wisconsin, a rural area and hunting and fishing, which I enjoyed tremendously, but ended up being the opposite. She's in Minnesota right now, and I'm living in New York. It's just interesting how things turn out, but we're both happy.
Jackie Davis, who we had an interview with, spoke very highly of you and the work you've done there in New York for advancing women's wrestling and the Gotham City tournament. What kind of things do you like to do to be able to advance wrestling and to see it grow in New York?
I think some of the biggest things, one of the things we've done that I really like and I see as a model for other parts of the country is during the winter season. So we have 2 seasons of wrestling in New York City. We have our girls season in the spring. That's a freestyle season. We have our boys season in the winter. That's a folk style season. And we introduced a new league 5 years ago, maybe. It's called blended wrestling. And it's particularly attractive for a lot of the smaller schools that are having troubles filling weight classes. And essentially with our blended league, you have 7 boys weight classes, 7 girls weight classes, I'm sorry, 8 boys weight classes and 8 girls weight classes. Boys wrestle boys, girls wrestle girls, but they're scoring points for the same team. So if you want to win a New York City championship and your school is in the blended wrestling, you're recruiting females to your team. And that to me has been really a game changer in growing participation among girls in the winter. What our data shows is when girls have the opportunity to wrestle other girls, they enjoy the sport more, they're more involved in the sport, they're engaged more, and their numbers are going up. It's a great sport. Wrestling's awesome, and like I said, it's for anybody. It shouldn't matter if you're a male or female. You're going to get benefits, and you're going to become a better person through your experience wrestling. So if we can put things in place to make that experience more positive, in this case, making sure that girls have the opportunities to compete against females, it makes it a better experience and a more welcoming environment for everyone. So that was one of the things we've really enjoyed. The girls spring freestyle season has been fantastic. It's really growing in New York City.
Are you onto something there with the blended league? This sounds like it has potential really to help wrestling grow. Maybe that could translate into the high school, because if it's girls competing against girls and guys against guys, but you have them all together, could that work?
It has worked for us. It's worked in New York City. When we started the blended league in the PSAL, I don't know if it was 5 or 6 years ago. I think we had 12 teams that joined. Now there's 20 teams that have opted to do the blended league as opposed to the boys only league. Every weekend in New York City now, it used to be just boys tournaments where girls would have to wrestle in the boys weight classes. Now every weekend during the winter, we have one tournament that's blended tournament. So yeah, I personally think that's the future of wrestling at the scholastic level. You get more people involved, and it doesn't cost any extra money. The teams are practicing together, they're traveling together, they're competing at tournaments together. The only difference is boys are wrestling boys, girls are wrestling girls. But from an administrative standpoint, I won't say it hasn't cost anything to add it, but the additional cost of including 50% more of your population has been minimal. So, you got to buy another set of medals for a tournament. Well, you've just welcomed half the kids in the city that couldn't wrestle in this tournament can now wrestle in it because there's a division for them, and the only extra cost was the awards. So I think it has a lot of potential. If I could snap my fingers and change it, the structure of wrestling right away, I would make wrestling a blended sport where you have to have a certain number of boys weight classes, a certain number of girls weight classes, and they're competing for the same team. It's similar with track, but in track, when you go to a meet, you have your boys squad, you have your girls squad, and you keep separate team scores. The thing I really like about the blended league is the boys and the girls on their team. They're seeing each other as equals. They have to depend on each other to win. And it's, it takes the idea of co-ed sports to a really, I think, a better level. So I like it. And
with your position, you deal with all sports, but when it comes to wrestling in particular, what can wrestling do to help itself grow and advance? Of course, we've had a couple D1 programs drop recently, but across the board, what can wrestling do to help itself?
That's a really difficult question. I don't know if I maybe have the insight and to answer that. I think certainly being more welcoming to females across the board would be huge. We're trying to get wrestling approved as a state championship sport in New York, and it's been tremendously difficult. And I think just the hurdles that are put in place to make it a championship sport really hurt the sport. You see states like Ohio, Ohio, Alabama added girls wrestling this year. I think just making that sport more accessible, we're ignoring half of our population. So I think for me, that's the biggest thing.
What do other sports say about wrestling that you've heard, the crosstalk of maybe, hey, this is our perception of what wrestling looks like, and maybe we could change that? Do you get any of that crosstalk?
No, not really. Not really. Not too much.
When we look at tournaments, though, and we look at what can happen with women's wrestling, what is the hang up there a little bit? We talked about New York not having a championship sport for women's wrestling. How do we change that? Like, what is the hang up? It seems like it's a pretty easy path in your head because it just makes sense they should have it. What's the hang up?
Yeah, you got me. I really don't know. It's baffling. It's frustrating. I joke that New York is going to be the 52nd state to sanction girls wrestling. Puerto Rico and Washington D.C. will be states, and they'll have wrestling before we do. But I don't know. It's been such a win-win in New York City. The funny thing too, in a lot of the country, when girls are on wrestling teams, they identify themselves as girls that wrestle. Because of a lot of girls in New York City grew up with the blended league, grew up wrestling freestyle, they don't see themselves as girls that wrestle. They see themselves as wrestlers, just because that's the environment they've grown up in. And I think that's really tremendous too. When females can do and are looking at themselves just as wrestlers and not girls that wrestle, when that identity shift takes place, which is happening in New York City, which has happened already in Hawaii and California, where you see those real strong cultures of wrestling. I think that's one of the bigger things that's going to help propel our sport and keep it popular and important.
How do you balance?
And coaches like Coach Davis. Coach Davis was a tremendous force in bringing girls to the mat in New York City. She's such a energetic, positive, just a tremendous coach that had an unmeasurable impact on a lot of the girls in New York City. So kudos to her. We certainly miss her and hope she gets back to New York City soon.
How do you balance your life with what you're doing with the PSAL and being an assistant coach at NYU?
It was the first time I did it this year. It worked out because at NYU they have 2 practices to accommodate the student athlete schedule. So wrestlers that have labs at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, 3 o'clock, they would not go to the 4 o'clock practice. There would be a 7 o'clock practice. And for me, with my schedule, I was never available before 6:30, 7 o'clock on the weekdays. So when Coach Haberly called me and he said, we have these 2 practice schedules, we have an evening schedule. I really, I know you can't be here early in the day, but we'd love to have you in helping run the practices, the late night practices. It was great. And, it worked out good. And it was an opportunity that I really wouldn't have at other schools just because of the practice schedule. And then, getting to know the student athletes, they were hungry, they were driven. So we started doing some morning practices, some one-on-ones with the upper weights. And it was tough. It was, some early morning trains and late night trains, but it was really great. It was great being on the mat coaching again. Because in my position with the PSL, it's more administrative, and though I get to see the kids, I'm not necessarily working with them on the mat. So I really enjoyed coaching this year.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on Beat the Streets for those who don't know what it looks like and the function and where they meet, where the practices are? Could you just give us the landscape on what that looks like?
Sure. So, a lot of times people think Beat the Streets is a wrestling club, and it's not really a wrestling club. It's more of an overarching nonprofit organization that assists New York City in promoting and growing and building the sport of wrestling. So Beat the Streets, in New York City, we don't have a middle school governing body for athletics. There is no real organized school athletics at the middle school level in New York City. So one of their big functions is they run the junior league, which brings wrestling opportunities into the middle schools. They also run supplemental training centers. Unlike most parts of the country, there isn't any for-profit private wrestling clubs in New York City. So if those student athletes want to get the extra practices, the extra coaching that their suburban peers are afforded at a private wrestling club, that opportunity is not there but for Beat the Streets. So, Beat the Streets serves as an administrator for the junior league. It serves as a quote unquote a wrestling club in providing high level coaching, high level practices, additional training opportunities for kids that normally wouldn't have access to those opportunities. They do wrestling camps over the holiday breaks. They started the academy, the Beat the Streets Academy last year, where they had a select number of student athletes that also did college counseling, SAT prep, college visits. They're a huge partner to the PSAL. You know, one of the unsung heroes of Beat the Streets is Ray Novelli. Ray is our logistics director. And you know, when we're growing up, if your high school wants to host a tournament, right? They call the neighboring school and say, "Can we borrow your mats?" Then they call John's dad, who has the flatbed truck, to move those mats. In New York City, no one has a car, let alone a flatbed mat. So when we're running right now, the public schools athletic team runs anywhere from 3 to 5 tournaments every single weekend, from late November until late February for the boys season, and then again during the girls freestyle season. So any given day, we're moving 70 some section of mats and score clocks and all the equipment needed to run tournaments are getting carted around on trucks and deposited in schools. So Ray Novelli oversees all of our mat moving, all of our equipment moving. You know, a lot of the schools in New York City, they don't have PA systems. They don't have internet in the gym. So when we go to a school, we have our tournament kits and they're rolling crates. So we have some, we have our track score clocks, which we love. And then we have another tournament crate with the printers, the PA system. So basically we bring a tournament to your school in a box, and every week we're moving those mats around, or Beat the Streets is moving those mats around to different New York City schools. So that's a small but enormous role that Beat the Streets plays in helping develop wrestling in New York City, because without Beat the Streets and without these tournaments, these student athletes would not have tournament opportunities. So, you know, out of the 80 some boys teams, there's maybe 10 of them that are able to fundraise to travel to tournaments outside of New York City. So those other 70 teams, if it wasn't for Beat the Streets, they would not have tournaments to wrestle in. So yeah, I think when I first came on as the programming director at Beat the Streets, there was maybe 2 or 3 tournaments the entire season that was in New York City. And it's just because logistically, it's really difficult, if not impossible, for individual schools to coordinate the equipment and everything that's needed to run a tournament. So that's one of the huge things that Beat the Streets does, among many. And you know, I'm going to put a plug in. They're having their virtual telethon on September 17th. We didn't have our big fundraiser, a big gala in the city this May like we usually did, obviously due to the pandemic. So put it on your calendars. September 17th, telethon. It's going to be 90 minutes. Have some great guests lined up, and the money that's raised during that telethon, that's the money that helps moves those mats around all winter, so that kids in New York City get an opportunity to compete in tournaments just like their suburban and rural peers get.
And it sounds like that's the unique part, is that New York City is like no other. And so you have to adjust and adapt to a different environment that wouldn't be rural like your environment that you grew up.
Yeah, no, it's wildly different. The coaches coast to coast really work their butts off and care about their kids. And I think the New York City coaches, just because they're dealing with such a lack of support and lack of resources, they're really going above and beyond. And those kids, it's the same way. I mean, the kids, it's not as if their parents are dropping them off at their high school parking lot in the morning and they're getting on a bus and going to a tournament. You know, the schools aren't budgeted for buses. These kids, you know, some of them, if you're going from South Brooklyn to a tournament in Bronx or Staten Island, you're going to be on public transportation for 3.5 hours sometimes. So these kids, if they're making a weigh-in that's starting at 8 o'clock, 8:30, some of them are getting on the buses and the subways at 4:30, 5 in the morning to get to those tournaments. So they're really, that's another lesson wrestling is teaching these kids, man. They really got to plan ahead. They got to know those schedules, those service changes, or they're not making weigh-ins.
We got to end with this, Ken. You have to describe what it's like to wrestle in the West Gym on the campus of Northern Iowa.
There's nothing better. The fans are on top of the mats. It's loud. It's rowdy. There's just so much support, so much energy. Obviously, I'm very biased. I think the West Gym is one of the most iconic wrestling venues in the nation. I certainly have never wrestled in an arena that was more energetic or more alive than the West Gym. It's awesome. And the wrestling room, especially with those arching brick windows and the natural light. It's a beautiful wrestling room. The whole building is iconic.